Welcome to Small Town Girl. I'm so thankful that you are here to be with us and to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for honoring us with your time and your engagement. I have a dear friend with me as a guest today. I'm excited to bring her home. She's from Arkansas, from Jasper, Arkansas, and has been all around, lives in California now. Her name is Lisa Pruitt, Dr. Lisa Pruitt, Juris Doctor. And we're going to have a conversation kind of publicly today that's been ongoing between us for a few years now. Lisa actually contacted me over email, I think, a few years ago in response to a column. She reads the Democrat-Gazette from her home in California and stays in touch with her home state. That's one of the ways. And she is a teacher at the law school, University of California, Davis, and the Martin Luther King Jr. chair, the department.
Well, I'm not a department chair, but I have a distinguished. I've been around long enough that they've given me the title distinguished professor and Brigida Bodenheimer research scholar. So it's a mouthful. But our law school is called the Martin Luther King Jr. School of Law.
That's okay. I did not know that.
Yeah.
And so, and I wanted to tell you more about her background because she's worked at The Hague and got a specialty degree in London, or worked, just a very, very distinguished mind we're engaging here today. And I was so honored when she wrote me. She was interested in talking about something that's very near and dear to my heart and hers, which is rural Arkansas and rural America, really. We had both kind of watched this phenomenon of the rise of Trump and particularly, a far right or MAGA movement in rural Arkansas, and had been, kind of disillusioned with some of the people we felt very close to and feel like we know very well, whose politics had diverged so far from what, from how we felt and from what we thought was the norm there. And so we started kind of talking about and trying to examine what had happened. And she wanted to come and meet some of my students and just talk to them and kind of see what the students, at a small university in Arkansas were like. And I was interested in doing that at her elite law school in California. Anyway, it's the friendship we have and the conversation that we have has been very enlightening to me, and we'll talk about how we've sort of augmented each other's understanding. Southern Loft believes that your home should reflect your unique personality. That's why they offer a wide variety of stylish furniture pieces that are perfect for any taste. Whether you're looking for a new sofa for your living room or a sleek dining table for your kitchen, they have just what you need. So when looking for that piece of furniture that reflects you, visit Southern Loft at 3155 North College in Fayetteville or call at 479-856-6100. First, I want to start, Lisa, and you just tell a little bit about your background. You're definitely a person Arkansas can be very proud of, with where you came from and what you've accomplished, and you just also have a very interesting story. So tell us about your childhood, your life, and then kind of where you've been to now, where you are now.
Okay, well, I'll try to keep it reasonably brief.
No, that's a big question, but
as I often say in conversations, to make a long story a little bit
Yes.
shorter, because I am given to long stories. But yes, I grew up in Jasper. I often acknowledge that I am a product of a working class household. My father was a long distance truck driver, and my mother started working at the school, at Jasper School, when my sister and I were old enough to go to school. And so she was a teacher's aide, and I forget what title she has now, but she had an opportunity when my sister and I, in the early 70s, when my sister and I were like in the 6 to 8 age range, Ozarks Opportunities organization was setting up Head Start programs, and there were not enough people with degrees, with the credentials to start a Head Start program in Jasper.
Yes.
And so my mom got identified as someone who would get a degree in early childhood education. And she did that over the course of several years, going to night school. We called it night school in Valley Springs and Green Forest. And so she eventually got her associate's degree in early childhood education through a program. The degree granting institution, I guess, was State Teachers College at BB.
Okay.
But all the curriculum was delivered in little rooms in Green Forest, Arkansas, and Valley Springs, Arkansas. And so I have some vivid memories of those years. Sometimes we got to go with her, but a lot of the times I've looked. I think I've counted up in her journal that she had about a dozen different caregivers for us.
Wow.
During that period of time. So talk about rural reliance on kith and kin.
Yes.
That was how she got it done. And my mom, who's still living, today is my mom's birthday.
Oh, wow.
Yay! I'm going to see her this weekend. I'm really excited. My mom really aspired for her daughters, for all her kids, to get an education so that we would have more opportunities than she had.
Yes.
Her marriage was a difficult one. My father was a difficult man. And so she wanted us to have choices. And so there was just a huge focus on formal education. So I came to the University of Arkansas, got a bachelor's in journalism, realized that I didn't have the personality to be a journalist at that point in my life. I think I had thought I was going to do the kind of journalism where you're like an anchor woman.
Okay. Yes.
But journalists weren't making much money in Arkansas then, and I didn't. And actually, journalists aren't making enough money anywhere now. Let me say that. I often tell my students that I would love to be a journalist now, but, because I just have the greatest admiration for journalists. And I think I have developed a personality now where I could, go out and be a go-getter. But my mom had long called me Last Word Lisa because I was so argumentative. And so there was this kind of long-standing joke in the family that Lisa ought to be a lawyer.
Yes.
So I'm finishing this degree in journalism. And I decided, just might as well go to law school. And so I did, and got disillusioned with being in Arkansas when I was in law school because I had naively believed, partly based on my mother's beliefs, that all the formal barriers for women were down. And the formal barriers for women were down, in law and in the professions, in the workplace. But the day that I was elected editor-in-chief of the Arkansas Law Review, a couple of men in my class put up a poster in the Law Review office that was like in the form of an election ballot. And it was Law Review, chief coffee maker, and it listed several women. And then it said chief head giver, and it listed several women, including me. And then it said head slut, and I was the only candidate for head slut. So this was the kind of harassment that
Oh my.
that came out, and I was really, blindsided by it,
Yes.
and was extremely hurt.
So when was that?
That was 1988, because
Okay.
I graduated from law school in '89.
Okay.
And I hadn't intended to tell this story, so you can delete it if you want. But
No, that's just very interesting. You're just a little ahead of me.
Right, because you started at the law school.
Right, 1995.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So I was there '86 to '89, and the law school's response was not. Let's just say it was not robust. It was not. It was not helpful. They kind of wanted to just ignore it, and that left me feeling very, unprotected, really. So there was a lot of harassment that ensued because, kind of good old boys refusing to do their share of the work and, that sort of thing. So it became clear that I was not going to be a tall building lawyer in Little Rock, which is what I had always assumed I would do. And I really felt the need to get the heck out of Dodge. So I was very fortunate. I got a scholarship to do my PhD at the University of London, and so that's what I went off to do. And then I wound up spending about a decade in Europe. I came back for a year and clerked for Judge Morris Shepard Arnold on the Eighth Circuit. And but I had really fallen in love with Europe, so I was able to go get a job in The Hague working for an international organization. And then I did some work in Rwanda, and then I went back to London and worked for a law firm. But the thing that had the aspiration that had gotten hold of me when I was in law school, because I loved the law. I loved parsing, the finer points of law and doing that appellate litigation type thing. But I also, I often say smart rural girls, and you know this, Gwen, smart rural girls are supposed to become teachers. And I had always thought that teaching was too ordinary, that I was going to do something bigger than that.
Yes.
But, I looked at what my law professors did, and I thought, oh, that's the perfect combination, because you get to be a teacher, but it's also, not an ordinary thing. And I want to be clear now that, like with journalists, I have the highest. I hold all teachers, all hardworking teachers, in the highest esteem. But and I don't think of it as an ordinary job. But I did then, and so
I can really relate to that. I just ran as hard as I could the other direction. That's how I ended up at law school and doing, different things, and just kind of came kicking and screaming back into education, and have found it, to be, like you're saying, I think you're saying it kind of a perfect fit, because for me, talking about words, great literature and writing, it's like a symbiotic relationship with what I do, and, the other, with the side of my life, writing and, communication like this. But you're right. There is an expectation, and it is not. There's a connotation with it, but there's that saying, "Those who can do and those who can't teach." I've always hated that so much, but it is that kind of idea. Like, this is the thing that. It's a great job for a woman. It's a great job for a mom, because you're off with your kids, which it is. But I understand the prickling towards that of,
Right.
that doesn't mean that is all I can do.
Right.
So, yes. So go on.
Yeah. Well,
that's how you ended up teaching.
That's how I wound up teaching. I circled back, and when I was, on the teaching market, they call it the meat market because it's fairly brutal. California is where I got the job. I had, by the time I went to work at the University of California at Davis in 1999. having lived in Europe for, like I said, almost a decade, I think I had been to something approaching 50 countries. I had a law professor who told me once, he had been to more countries than that, but he told me it is bad karma to count countries. And so I don't want to be, too specific, but let's just say I had sort of been around the world, but I had never been west of Oklahoma City in the United States. I had always looked east. I had always looked to Europe, and ultimately to other places in the world. So when I got the opportunity to interview for this job at the University of California at Davis, it was like the first time I'd been in the state of California, and but that's where I got the job, and so I moved there in 1999. Met my husband, the man who's now my husband, the next year, and ultimately we were married. And so, it's hard to believe that I am finishing my 27th year of teaching, and it is such a blessing to be able to teach. I was reading your recent column about the end of the semester, and it resonated with me in so many ways. I have had ups and downs with teaching. There have been times when I will admit my students were driving me crazy.
Sure.
The pandemic, as we all know, was very, very hard for educators. It's very hard for students.
Yes.
And but I have really been enjoying teaching again the last few years.
I'm so glad.
And I think it's because I am once again leaning into teaching as relationship, right? Teaching is really, if you can get to know your students, and they're all pretty darn interesting as individuals,
Everybody
right?
has a story.
Everybody has a story, and if you can lean into that and enjoy them as individuals, and with their quirks and their limitations, and
that's really where I want to start with kind of our exchange. Why did you want to interview some students from Arkansas?
Well, the long story is, I had written a manuscript, a book manuscript, and I had a and that manuscript I call Educated Arrogance, and it was really telling the parallel stories of my mother and me, and our politics, because I was raised in a staunchly Democratic household, but early in the pandemic, my mother revealed herself to my sister and to me in a group text as being pro-Trump. And I had already been working on this concept of sort of our parallel trajectories, if you will, because in some ways, because my mom, had me when she was 20, and I was her second child, right? My mom married the day that she finished high school, and which happened to be the day that my father turned 19, and so. As my mom even has said, right, that opportunity to get a degree in early childhood education when her kids were young, it really it really changed her life. Just that exposure, to higher education and new ideas, and so forth and so on. So, my mom says sometimes, it taught her how to live. It changed some of her expectations and so forth. But so in some ways, this may sound silly, but we were growing up together.
Yes.
And my mom sometimes expresses it that way, right? A child raising children in a way. Sense. But we had these very different opportunities. We had these very different life experiences. My mom was, my mom's parents got indoor plumbing after I finished law school. They got indoor plumbing in 1991, which is, as people will appreciate, was very, very late in the game, right? And so we just had very different opportunities. My mom would have loved to have gone to college.
Yes.
I have enjoyed, talking to her and learning about what her aspirations were, and also, grappling with how sad it was that she couldn't go to Arkansas Tech. Her parents, as she often has said, were, obviously didn't have any money, and this was before there were the student loan opportunities and these federal programs and so forth. So anyway, I living abroad and then ultimately living the life of the mind as an academic, living in bright blue California, I became an even more left-leaning Democrat, probably a different type of Democrat, than I had been raised by.
Yes.
But then, my mom, who had been active in the Democratic Party in Newton County and had been a leader in the Democratic Party.
This is when all of Arkansas was Democrat.
This was when
Southern Democrats.
Exactly.
Yes.
This was before the red wave, marched across the South, and as your viewers will know, Arkansas was one of the last states to fall, if you will, if you want to use that terminology. And so anyway, the book manuscript really is about how we are both, each of us is a product of our environment, right? And why she came to hold the views that she has now.
So just processing that.
And also the reason that I ultimately gave the book manuscript the title Educated Arrogance is because I realized that I had become an educated arrogant, right? And that I was I was the educated arrogant who was most present in my mother's world, right?
The elite.
I'm the elite.
Yeah.
I'm the one using big words, talking in abstract terms, psychoanalyzing her and everybody else around me, and things like that. So I thought if I could tell the story in this way, it would cultivate understanding and empathy across the red-blue divide. Because I often, say I'm I'm a dual national, right? I grew up in what is now ruby red Arkansas, but I live in bright blue, the capital. I live in Sacramento, the capital of maybe the bluest of the blue states.
So why did you think talking to my students would help inform that?
Yes, I'm glad you circled back to that. So I had a contract to publish this book with Norton, and at some point, a very junior editor got a hold of the manuscript and said, "You've got to call your mother a racist," and sort of called out all these things that she saw as racist. And I had people say to me, "You're not giving a full-throated defense of wokeness." And I was like, "That's right, because I can't give a full-throated defense of wokeness. I'm trying. That's not the." If that's what it takes to get a book published, right? And so the commissioning editor, said to me, as she was pulling the plug on the book, "Nobody can bear to hear another word about Trump." This was January of 2023. And the book was very much, using the rise of Trump and, so forth, right, to illustrate and sort of make the point of how this divide had emerged. So anyway, the editor said, "Well, I want you to continue to have this book contract, but you have to come up with a different book." And so one of the ideas was how are rural, and my expertise, we should say, is in rural issues.
Right.
So we thought, well, how about a book about rural youth? And so I just
kind of switch gears.
Switch gears, and I came to Arkansas that spring. I guess that was 2 years ago. Was that 2 years ago or 3 years ago?
Yeah.
And interviewed some of your students, chatted with some of your students. I am inherently interested in, what I call class migration.
Yes.
Like, how do kids do things? They don't have to be as dramatic as I've done, but this access to opportunity.
Yes.
How does it how does it work? And then as a related matter, because I'm also a political junkie, I wanted to talk to young people from a variety of backgrounds about their views on politics. I think at that point, maybe it was 3 years ago, I think a lot of people thought that the youth vote was that the youth vote would never migrate to Trump to the extent that it has.
Yes.
Right. So it was great. I met you in Ozark and met a bunch of your just like mind-blowing students. I have mind-blowing students too, but they're often mind-blowing in different ways,
Yes.
right?
So talk about that a little bit. Like, what did you find with my students?
Well, the journeys of some of your students. I remember the student who had a history of a very deep and tortured history of addiction, who had gotten clean and was training to be an IT professional. It was the details of his story, and I know your students' stories because they're often writing about their lives in the exercises that they do for you, the writing exercises. Several Latina students, right? And I was struck by how many of your students were commuting from Alma and from Fort Smith.
In Clarksville.
And,
all around.
All around. And I would say, well, why are you commuting? Why aren't you just going to, University of Arkansas, Fort Smith?
Right,
and they're
right.
like, because Arkansas Tech Ozark has more supportive. Because we feel we know that we'll get more support here.
Yes.
And a lot of the students really need support. They were
Yes, they
working part-time, if not full-time, right? And I remember one of your students. Some of your students were planning to go into the military. One aspired to be a state trooper. So I just think it's super. I'm really interested in people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so my students tend to be more privileged than yours, but we also have a lot of students at the law school who are the children of farm workers, right? Maybe some of our students are not documented, but many of our students of many of our Latino students and Asian American students and so forth. They are, they are U.S. citizens, but their parents were, the first generation to migrate. And so, boy, they have worked, and their parents have worked so hard to get them through university, to get them that bachelor's degree, and now they're in law school, and they often feel out of place because there's also a lot of rich kids at our law school.
Yes. Well, that was one of the things I kind of want to get into because I think it will be interesting, particularly for my Democratic friends, my more left-leaning friends here in Arkansas and readers, to hear this part of our story, because before I met you, I thought that all this talk about, wokeness and indoctrination in schools and, this mindset of universities being, just centers of elitism and far left, ideas and indoctrination, but certainly like public schools being that way. I just thought that was so ridiculous and so dishonest, and also just I thought it was made up. And I do think it is in Arkansas. I several times have issued challenges to politicians who use that as talking points, all this woke indoctrination happening. Show me one place where that's happening in a school in Arkansas. And no one's ever taken me up on it. And I suspect that's because they can't. There's not, it's not happening in schools in Arkansas. Largely, I'm not going to speculate all the reasons why, but most of the teachers in Arkansas are not woke. We're also not indoctrinators. If you ever teach in a public school, you understand pretty quickly how hard it is just to survive and teach the math or the English or whatever, the science, whatever skills, your students are supposed to acquire so that they can, then prove that on a test. And so the idea that there are teachers in Arkansas, teaching kids to feel bad about being white or to hate America it's ludicrous. We have a very proud tradition, I think, in Arkansas of being patriotic Americans, saying the Pledge of Allegiance at school, having a moment of silence, putting our hands on our heart to listen to the Star Spangled Banner, someone singing it or playing it, in the band at ball games. And these things that were not considered, Republican or Democrat or left or right, but just like American, just patriotic American when I was growing up, and part of a national pride, not nationalistic, but a point of pride. And so, like I said, in my experience as a student, and then as a parent of public school students, and then students in universities, and myself a university teacher, that has just been a lie to me. It's been a talking point that, unfortunately whips up the base here and scares people. And they talk about, teachers' unions and all this, which unions, Arkansas is a non-union state. Like, we do not have a teachers' union here. And so the thing is, they'll talk about politicians talk about these talking points, and then people, voters, talk about it as if it's real, as if it's happening, and no one can give me an example of it. And it's funny because nobody thinks it's happening like in their school, but it's got to be happening in other places all over Arkansas. And so we have to elect these people who are going to safeguard it. And then I have students coming to me who, don't know some very basic, points of history involving, Black Americans, or, who haven't been exposed to, say, the letter from a Birmingham jail and things like that. So it's so completely obvious to me that they're not indoctrinated.
Right. They haven't heard too much about the civil rights movement if they have never read.
Right.
Yeah.
And from my view, not enough, not a balanced view of reality. And so,
and history, right?
Yes. And so, don't know much about the Little Rock Nine, and that's in our very own state. Things like that. And so,
and by the way, those are things I was raised not knowing about, right?
Right.
This was not part of the curriculum.
Well, same here.
Yeah.
And so that's another reason why I've, based this on. This is like not this, I've been there. So my experience, and my kids are there right now. It's not their experience. So where's this happening? Right. Well, it turns out and that's the setup for all this, because really a lot of non-MAGA people here from from center right all the way to the 2 or 3 far left people that may live in
inhabit
Arkansas.
Right.
Have kind of this same idea that's just a made up like fairy
Right.
tale that politicians say to scare people here, but it's not really happening. Then I talked to you, and lo and behold, some of that is happening where you live, has happened, and I want you to tell readers more about that, but there are a couple things, that have stood out to me. One is your story, even just recently, about not being able to ask someone where they're from. I want you to tell that story. But then particularly something, that you told me about students one time questioning your syllabus, that it wasn't woke enough, and kind of the virtue signaling that went on. Those are things that they're laughable to me here, because when politicians talk about them, I'm just like, that's not a thing.
Right.
But then to hear that it is a thing at some places and has been real in your experience has been very eye-opening for me. So if you wouldn't mind, just talk a little bit about the culture where you can't ask someone where they're from and why, and then maybe move that to your experiences in the classroom.
Yeah, sure. The first thing we learn in law school, as you may remember, Gwen, is you got to first thing you do is define your terms,
Yes.
right? And wokeness, right, are terms that we would have to define if we were going to really pin down,
Yes.
is a practice woke or is it not, right? And I have these conversations with my students in my seminars, and I think we can all agree that different people would define the term differently.
Right.
So I want to acknowledge that right out of the gate. But yeah, in California, if you ask someone, particularly someone who is not, obviously, white, European, where they're from, that is a no-no. And one day, one of my colleagues expressed it as, if you ask me or you ask a non-white student where they're from, you're really asking them, why aren't you white? And that's not why I ask it.
It's not why you would ask it.
Not why I would ask it. I mean, among other things, I'm a geography nut, and I like I love talking about place, and it's just it's a data point about someone, and it's a part of their story, right? And it also helps me remember them, right? Then you've got I know, okay, if I forget your name, I may remember. Where you're from. And so now when I do that, which I always do at the first day of class, I am careful to say, I'm just doing this because I'm a geography nut, right? Not because I'm saying if you're a person of color or someone who has a non-U.S. accent, that you don't belong here. And I was shopping with a friend yesterday up in Rogers, and there was this really, really lovely and talented Latina salesperson who was helping us. And she was just so cheerful and so lovely, and she had a slight accent. And I just, I wanted to ask her where she was from. But I turned to my friend later and said, I really wanted to know where she was from, and just compliment her on her lilt.
Yes.
But I said, you can't do that in California. And my friend said, oh, you could do it here. She probably would have just grinned from ear to ear, right?
Right.
And so, I just think there's something kind of lost in that, because I don't see it as again, suggesting in any way that this person doesn't belong here.
Right.
And then on the syllabus anecdote.
Just real quick,
Yes,
I think something that we probably share in our Pollyanna-ish personalities, which that's got to have its roots somewhere in rural Southern culture too. But
nice girls don't rock the boat, or nice girls
something.
remain optimistic, or something.
Well, it's just, but I do think, like, even psychologists will say assume good intentions.
Yes.
And that's kind of a way of looking out at the world that is healthy. And that it's not to be stupid, and ignore, when someone shows you their bad intentions, but assuming good intentions is a good sort of approach to human relations. And it seems to me that, in your experience in California, the assumption is that you're a racist if you say that your intention is mean or bad in some way, not that you're curious. And I would even go so far as to say an honoring of culture.
Right.
Because what it reminds me, your colleague who said, that you're basically saying, why are you not white if you ask where you're from? That reminds me, we hate this saying, I don't see color.
Right.
Of course, because color is part of our diversity. It's part of, that's an insult if I say that to a person, a friend who's a person of color. But it's almost like that's what your colleague is saying.
Right.
Is don't say it, ignore it, act like it's not there, instead of being curious.
Right.
About it. And I'm sure someone with bad intentions somewhere along the way could and has said, well, where are you from? It's obviously not here.
Right.
But it's a conversation ender when
Right.
we cancel someone. That's cancel culture, right? When we say, you're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to have that question.
Well, right. And it turns out there are lots of conversation stoppers and lots of things people no longer have meaningful conversations about because, we are afraid that something can be, labeled, that we're going to be labeled racist, that there's going to be that presumption then that you really do get shut down. And I like the way you're framing it. It's a conversation stopper, and it causes the person, who may have asked what they see as an innocent and curious question to kind of, slunk away with their tail between their legs and not again sort of seek to have that kind of engagement with other people because you're so afraid of being
hurting
smacked
someone's
down.
feelings.
Yeah.
Or,
well, hurting
yes,
someone's feelings, yeah, for sure. Or, being sort of smacked down.
Judged.
Judged,
Yeah.
yeah. I think you used the word presumption, right? There's a presumption operating then that, that you are racist. And I will also say, being an Arkansan with a lingering Southern accent, right? Being a person who I still identify to my students. My students know how much I love Arkansas.
Yes.
Right? It's home, and I joke about being a dual national, and and I'll find myself saying, because I teach about rural issues, so I have lots of opportunities to to reference Arkansas and things that are going on in Arkansas. And I'll say something like, well, we just did this in Arkansas, and I'll catch myself like, and then I realize.
Right?
Right. Yeah.
Wasn't
Okay.
you?
I'm not,
Yeah.
And then I'll make the dual national joke. But, assumptions get made about people from the South, especially outside the South, especially if you are not rejecting, if you're not like making it very clear that you're not of that place or you've rejected that place. And I think that's a lot to ask of people who migrate from one place to another. Certainly in California, we don't expect it of immigrants. We don't expect them to reject the culture that they're coming from.
Right.
So why do we expect it of Southerners to just be out in the world acting like everything in the South is negative and there's nothing redeeming, and all those people are retrograde and behind and not looking for for the good in them.
So tell listeners what happened with your
the
syllabus. So I thought this was so fascinating.
Yeah. So I teach 2 seminars. One is called Law and Rural Livelihoods, and the other is called The First Gen Experience in Scholarly and Popular Literature. And both of these, in both of these classes, my syllabi have, readings that are expressly about race, Blackness, African Americanness, Native American experiences and issues, immigration. There's been a massive Latino influx into rural America, including here in Arkansas, including the rural South. And so we talk about all these issues. We talk about, gender is explicitly on the syllabus and so forth. So, I had some students complain a few years ago that I had put some readings about missing and murdered Indigenous women on the Native American part of the syllabus, but not on the gender part of the syllabus. So it's like, they didn't see it on this part of the syllabus. Basically the message was there's not enough. You're ignoring missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I'm like, well, no, I'm not. It's over here. So there's sort of a, students are much more have much more of a consumer mentality, which in some ways is good, right? But there has been this trend towards students complaining. It hasn't only happened, to me. It's happened to some of my colleagues, people also who teach at other law schools. This sort of, you're not adequately woke. You're not covering the stuff that we think you should be covering. And that input can be helpful, right? But again, you can't please all the people,
Which is so
right?
fascinating to me because, in my column, I kind of joked, but it is, there are threats like this, made from government officials here, of you better not be doing anything woke in your classrooms, or libraries, you got to make sure you don't have certain kind of books and certain kind of information. And, we don't want PBS because it might have this, kind of programming. And so, I don't ever remember a student complaining, to my face, certainly about, there's too much, why are we reading, this African American writer? Or why are we, talking about, why are we reading this poetry by Latinas or I don't remember anyone ever complaining about that. But I do have an awareness in my head that someone could ask me. Sure. I always do have like my reasons why we're reading this and ready. And usually I do explain to my students anyway, because I think it's important to know why we do what we do, and that helps you, see the relevance and be interested in what you're doing in a class. But it's just juxtaposing that with being afraid that someone would complain about, or that, I could get in trouble possibly for teaching Letter from a Birmingham Jail or whatever. I keep referring to it because I just think it's a masterpiece of American literature, and so it's just completely ludicrous to me that that anyone would not have it on their syllabus,
or would object to it.
Yes,
being there,
like it,
right?
it should be. It's
Right.
what I mean. It should be, I think, required reading, like for every American who
Right.
graduates from high school, and so to come from. That's my situation, is this fear of, woke
Right.
indoctrination, or I think this fake fear of it.
Right.
And then to imagine a classroom where students are saying that your syllabus is not woke enough, questioning your political correctness or your virtue.
Right.
Because, and you're their professor, I mean, you have your law degree and your PhD, and you've been doing this a long. Like, that's just so disrespectful to me. That's someone.
Right.
Like,
I try not
you
to,
know what your job is,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and you get to make the syllabus because you're qualified to do
Right,
that.
right,
You know,
right.
and so there's that element.
You mentioned earlier the patriotism thing, right? The American, Pledge of Allegiance
Right.
and so forth and so on. It reminds me of one of the conversations that I had with my students within the last few years in my law and rural livelihoods class, and the students said they were uncomfortable. Some students, I don't want to say like everybody in the class, but there was a critical mass of students who said that they would never display the American flag because basically it had been appropriated by MAGA and the right. And I said, wow. And this has also come up in relation to religion, right? Because religion can be seen as very anti-intellectual.
Yes.
And I am a practicing Christian. And so for years, I just definitely made sure I didn't let anybody know that in my workplace, right? Because, again, it would feed into the Southern, middle-aged white woman, lingering Southern accent, churchgoer. This person's got to be, from the Stone Ages, right? And so, but I just kind of push back on that to my students, like, wow, I mean, I'm not willing to cede some things to the right. Like, if I love this country.
Yes.
And this country makes mistakes. It's, to me, in my view, it's making a lot of mistakes right now. And I think I see Trump as a mistake. I won't, I won't pussyfoot around that one.
Me too, right.
But and historically we've made mistakes, right? I mean, big ones,
Right.
But I can still love my country, and I can still be proud of the flag. And I'm not willing to cede that to the right. Like, I'm going to fight for that. I was really happy. I guess it was was it maybe the first No Kings rally? Or, one of the No Kings rally, a big deal was made about wear your American flag pin. And I'm like, yes, we got to get back in there and claim these things. Why would we, I'm repeating myself now, why would we cede this thing to the other side?
That is probably one of the places we meet most strongly, because that is exactly how I feel. It's in a different way here, because it's almost like if you're not MAGA here, certainly, where I come from, then you're not patriotic. You're,
you don't love this country,
right? Well, I mean, and and if you speak out against, Trump or MAGA, our governor or whoever, you're a traitor or something. And of course, I experienced that when I ran for office. Some of that, you're assumed to be, the communist and a baby killer and
a demon,
all that, right? But for me, it is important to not cede those definitions. Like, I don't own those definitions. And I'm not going to tell someone else, like, to be a Christian, you have to believe this way. But I'm also not going to let somebody tell me, if you don't believe this way, you're not a Christian.
Right.
Because I am.
Right. And I'm that's not my call to make.
As an American, and the same thing as a patriot. In fact, I think there's an ongoing tension, and there has been since the beginning. There's been a fight, per se, for who gets to define that. And a lot of times, or sometimes, it has gone in a direction where, America was making certain choices that part of her citizens, were not happy with.
Right.
And then part of the time, it's been the other way around, and there is this tension for the soul of America. And I think it is very important that we, stand up and say, for my part,
Right.
I've been following James Tallarico pretty closely.
Me too,
Because when he says, this is what a Christian is to me, I'm like, yes, or this is what an
That's how I
American
read the
is,
Bible.
or this is how, right. So, Lisa, I think, you're one of the great minds that we have access to, not only as Arkansans but as Americans. You've studied, you've devoted a lot of your life to understanding and trying to heal this divide. What do you think, practically speaking, Arkansans who care, like you do about, as your own family, and you want to understand where they're coming from, what their needs are, how can we, heal this political divide between us? What are some practical things that you see that we can do, just even like, in our own spheres of influence, to kind of meet people in the middle?
Yeah. Well, I do think about this a lot.
Yes, I know.
I wrote that whole darn book about it that
Right.
I'm still going to try to get published at some point. I think we have to keep being in conversation with each other, right? And I find myself doing the psychotherapy practice of tell me more. Tell me
Yes.
more. I want to understand why you have reached this conclusion, that you have. And
Like a curiosity rather than a judgment.
right.
Yeah.
And also, people talk about this in the political realm as deep canvassing, right? You've got to get in there and talk to people in a community and get to know what their concerns are and really let them know that you're listening to them, right? You're hearing. It's very
to
time
understand
consuming.
like why,
Right.
because sometimes we have the same like needs or goals or desires, but it drives some people to the far right, and then maybe some people away from the far right. I'm not saying to the far left, but for me, I'll try to explain to people. I wasn't, and you may feel different about this, but I was not a fan of Kamala Harris, of the vice president. She wasn't someone that I was excited about as a president. But I would have voted for almost anyone else. It wasn't like for our governor here, we had this wonderful person who's a friend of mine, a rocket scientist, a minister.
Chris Jones.
I was thrilled to
Right.
vote for him and
Right.
support him, and I would, for anything that he was running for. But in the previous election, I don't, or our previous governor, I didn't agree with Asa Hutchinson about everything, but I thought he was a good governor. And, for me, it's easy to. I don't necessarily. If we had a good person or a good someone I felt confident in any party, that's where I'm going to vote. For example, this Colt Shelby, who's a libertarian running against Sanders, and he's from my community. I'm so thrilled for him to vote for him. But I don't want to do a either or side or like a whataboutism, because my rejection of the far right if I believed that someone was on the far left, I would reject that just as strongly. It's just that, for instance, like I know Chris Jones not to be that.
Right. Right.
But I guess what I'm saying is, my beliefs and my needs sort of drive me, to inhabit this space that's mostly middle, sometimes middle left. I'm sure to people in California would definitely be middle right, so
maybe.
So it seems to me like what you're saying is you have to get deep enough in a conversation to see what it is. What's the
common ground?
Yes.
Right?
But I was thinking too, like, what is the thing within someone that like turns them?
Yeah. And sometimes I think people don't actually know what it is, right?
I was going to
Because
ask you
sometimes
if you've
it's
been able to do that, like with your mom.
Yeah.
What is it you think that turned her from being this sort of progressive-minded woman?
Well, I think it's a number of things, and I think that's true of a lot of people. Particularly, I find myself really intrigued by the Obama-Trump voters, right? The people who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, and I think the data show that that's like 9%, which is like a lot of people, right? And so I think there's a lot of factors, right? It's never one thing. Mm-hmm. And for my mother, part of it is that she became cynical and lost trust in institutions. Mm-hmm. And I was listening to, I guess it was the NPR Politics podcast the other day about how the left has now started doing this conspiracy theory thing. The left is falling into conspiracy theories. For example, around the recent shooting at the hotel where Trump was for the Correspondents' Dinner, apparently there's a conspiracy theory on the left that that was all contrived so that support can be garnered for Trump's ballroom, right? And I just was so disappointed to hear that this type of thinking is taking hold on the left. Because if you become that cynical, right? So one of the things, I hear from my mother when I point out, Trump's corruption and some of the things in his history that are very unsavory, obviously, on any number of fronts, right? She says, "Oh, everybody does it," right? So if your view of institutions and politicians is they're all corrupt, then it's almost like a race to the bottom, right? And you're not, then voters aren't going to judge any politician for being corrupt. If your view is just, well, they're all on the make, and I do find I do find the conspiracy theory phenomenon very, very disturbing. I think that, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think a lot of people. I mean, speaking of conspiracy theories, there's a great deal of misinformation out there, and some people are more rigorous about vetting. Right, what they take in as sources of information. My students have started teasing me recently because, apparently once a week in torts class of all things, I will point out that they should only be getting their news from legacy media. And we could define what we mean by legacy media. I personally am a huge devotee of the New York Times, and there are lots of reasons for that. I think they've tried to be balanced. I think they have been balanced. I hear people on the left saying, oh, the New York Times hasn't been hard enough on Trump. And I'm like, well, but if they were, it wouldn't do any good, because if you're trying to convert MAGA, they already don't trust the New York Times, right? And among other things, I said to my students recently, you may because the really progressive students, right, they don't like the New York Times. They don't, right, or they've got their reasons. again, not far enough to the left
Right.
for those students. And I said, yeah, you can disagree with their editorial stance, but the New York Times does what, as far as I can tell, no other institution in the world does. Maybe the BBC, right? I mean, they have got journalists on the ground. And when I hear an intelligent person say something about, something that they picked up from or an intelligent or someone I don't consider to be intelligent. When I hear anyone say, and often people with a lot of formal education, I hear saying things now like, our troops in the Middle East are, being told by generals that this is a holy war and invoking religion as a reason for this war. I say, that's very interesting. When the New York Times reports it, I said that if that's going on, the New York Times is going to find out, and it's going to get reported. Now, since that time, the New York Times has, in fact, they haven't confirmed that exactly, but they have done a deep dive into, this crusader mentality, if you will, right?
Yes.
So I think misinformation plays a huge role. So if you don't trust any of the institutions anymore, if you're cynical about all the institutions, from the legacy media to all the politicians, then it's kind of a crapshoot, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it's whoever appeals to me. One of my preoccupations, as I think you know, is how to build cross-racial coalitions to enact progressive policies, right? And what I hear and see are two conflicting messages sent to white people. And there is a lot of focus on whiteness in California,
Yeah.
in my bright blue liberal progressive, bubble, right? One is, this constant talk about white privilege and white fragility. And again, white privilege can be defined a million different ways, right? Sometimes my students express it as, you're white, you'll be all right. And that's well, no, actually, I know a lot of white people who are not all right. And they're struggling with any of a number of issues, including socioeconomic,
Right.
disadvantage, right? So white fragility, if you push back about anything that, if you push back about my definition of racism, then you are, by definition racist. Some of these ideas, I think, conflict with then saying to low-income white people, why do you vote against your own interests, right? Because on the one hand, we are saying white people are invulnerable because they have white skin, and on the other hand, we're saying, well, you're vulnerable, so why are you voting against your own interests, right? And I'm not sure that progressives are thinking through some of these things. So there's just all these buzz phrases that can get construed in ways that are hurtful to. I think they're actually hurtful. I think in terms a lot in terms of my parents and even my own trajectory. I can see why my mother. I can see why something in an academic volume or a quasi-academic volume, let's take the White Fragility book, or maybe something Ibram Kendi has written, and that can be used in ways that feel like cudgels to low-income white people who really are struggling,
Right.
And so what is it we're really trying to communicate to white people? And I don't think you can draw white people into, this is a slight, I'm making this statement too broad, but I think it's going to be very hard to draw many white people into a cross-racial coalition if we don't acknowledge their vulnerability and their
Really
disadvantage.
based on income or class.
Yes, and
Not-
it can be on other
not
bases too,
ethnicity,
but yeah. And so all the talk about, I think to some extent I see the bubble bursting in California, because there's already less talk in the last couple of years about, white privilege just being kind of hurled. Just this kind of constant refrain anytime you can say it, and I would just be thinking, like, what? I'm not seeing why the phrase white privilege is relevant to that conversation.
Right.
So it
is relevant to some conversations.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. But again, you'd kind of need to define exactly. Are we going to define it really capaciously as, and I think about the white privilege concept also in relation to agency.
Yes.
Moral agency. So, I've certainly had communicated to me before that I am, for example, I am where I am because of white privilege. Well, I'm sure that being white has certainly been an advantage, but there's a lot more that's gone on besides my white skin that impacts where I am. So if I take that frame, that kind of way of thinking about it, and I apply it to people like my mom, my father is long dead, but just how hard they worked.
Yes.
How very hard they worked, how close to the bone everything was. And in many ways still is for my mom.
Yes.
She's 82 and she's still working at the Jasper school.
Yes.
And so don't we want to give people like that credit for their hard work? I sometimes think if we said something like, going back to the deep canvassing and how do you have these conversations, if you said something to a working class white person, I can see you've been working really hard. You've been using, you wouldn't want to say this to a working class white person because this would be lapsing into academic talk. But basically, you are exercising your human agency to try to bootstrap, right? Because just like there's structural racism, there are structures that keep poor white people down as well.
Sure.
Right? And so what if we said, gosh, I can see you've been working really hard, and I can see how frustrated
that is kind of what
are.
Trump said.
Right. Yes. Okay. Well,
And
that
I'll
brings me
save
to
you.
Yes. So that brings me to another point. I have started. I will just be perfectly honest. I am one of those people who finds Trump so repulsive. I can barely bear to listen to his voice or look at his photo. Right. But I have tried really hard. I am trying really hard to find things that Trump has done that I can support. Here's an example. Well, this isn't something Trump has done, but it is something that Republicans have done, and I tend to be very partisan. I admit it. I tend to be just very hardcore Democrat. But in Mississippi, the New York Times recently did a daily podcast.
Education in Mississippi.
Yes.
It's amazing.
So,
I know.
let's get on the bandwagon.
Yes, please.
Right?
Yes.
So let's not say that Republicans aren't doing anything
Well, the rural
because
Republicans
the proof is in the pudding.
in Mississippi stood up against school vouchers. Said, no, we're not doing that. It will ruin our rural schools.
Yeah, and Texas and
Why
Arkansas
can't
went
they do
exactly
that?
the opposite
Yeah,
direction.
why
can't we do that? Exactly. So I think we've got to, California is notoriously soft on crime, right? And, something else that happens at the law school is the students who aspire to be prosecutors self-censor and don't talk about wanting to be prosecutors because that's considered a bad way to spend your career. That's kind of the vibe at my law school. My law school is so progressive, and I know this happens at some other law schools, not all law schools, right? A woman wrote about it a few years ago in the context of Stanford, and the way she expressed it is, the joke is, or the thing that gets said behind the people's back is, anybody who articulates a conservative viewpoint, well, that's a future prosecutor. Whatever your beliefs about the criminal justice system. Prosecutors are part of the solution, right?
Yes,
They can,
for sure.
You know, right? So
It's a balance.
It's a balance.
Like we have to have a balance.
And I feel, you know, you were saying earlier that you might see yourself as center left. I will say that some of the extremes that I have witnessed in California politics and policymaking in recent years have pushed me more to the center. I mean, I think at one point I was out there maybe because I was virtue signaling, even though I might not want to admit it, or maybe I was trying to fend off those assumptions that would be made about me as a middle-aged white woman with a lingering Southern accent.
Right.
And I was chasing the vanguard of the left, but you know, I'm rethinking a lot of things, right?
Yes.
So, you know, maybe another helpful example is, and this is related to the issue of agency and hard work, right? Is the phrase personal responsibility. So this came up in my class recently, and and I sort of used it as an example. I was being provocative, like aren't we in favor of personal responsibility, right? Like, how did the Democrats, how did the left let that become this phrase that is that how did we let them appropriate that phrase to mean something about whether you're on welfare or, you know, whatever? Because this student yelled out, you know, well, that's a dog whistle if you say personal responsibility. And I said, well, who gets to decide if it's a dog whistle? Right? Who gets to decide if it's a dog whistle? Because it's kind of like our discussion earlier about the American flag. Like, no, I'm actually in favor of personal responsibility. It doesn't mean that I'm oblivious to, again, structural forces that work against people being able to succeed and achieve and pay their rent, or, you know, have health care, right? I don't want to ignore that, but I certainly don't want to live in a world where we just all throw in the towel and say, you know,
nobody has to take personal
responsibility.
Right.
So, you know, a lot of things in California are construed as dog whistles, and I'm sure in other more progressive, you know, places, milieu. And so I've started like having those kinds of conversations. Like, when did we seed this concept, you know, to the right? Because I'm actually for personal responsibility.
We better be.
Yeah. So, you know, there are these other factors as well that we need to grapple with when we talk about equity, when we talk about how people are not starting. It's not a level playing field.
Right.
And I tell my students, we're never going to have a level playing field. Is the playing field even more unlevel at some times than others? Like, has it become less level under Trump? Yes, it has. But what are we going to do in the face of that?
Right.
We're going to do what we can.
Right.
We're going to keep pushing forward. You're here. You're getting a law degree. You're doing it. And I'm not saying don't feel your feelings, but
and seek a balance rather than, you know, for the pendulum to swing out one way or the other. We could just continue this conversation forever, and I hope we will.
We will, just in private.
Yes. But thank you so much for being here and for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us, and your approach, you know, which is hard work. And, you know, I think that a lot of us want a quick fix or a magic bullet, but I think bridge building, like you're talking about, is hard work. But I also think it's worth it, you know, kind of like you're saying. It's worth it.
We don't have any choice, do we?
No.
I don't think we have any choice. Well, it's been great to be here. Thank you for having me. And I so value your friendship and your voice. I I love reading your columns. And
thank you.
So thank you.
Same here. That's Lisa Pruitt. Thank you so much for being with us.